Let's get excited.
Well, let's do this.
eCash.
Yeah. Let's settle this once and for all, Seth.
I like it. In person. It's not going to be the karate match thing round 2, though, right?
The what?
Karate match? I don't know.
No, not for me. I didn't train for this one. Okay, well, thanks for being here, guys. I'm not sure what you thought of the political noise over there, but we're trying to clear that up with some signal, hopefully on stage this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be joined by a lot of interesting minds in the space. We've got buddy Ben Ark over there at LNbits, Kody, who works at Fedi, Eric, who is building Epoch, and Seth from Foundation. I'm Alex B. I'm a reporter at Bitcoin Magazine, and we're going to be talking about eCash, and we'll be covering, hopefully, see what are the upsides, see what are the downsides, and what the future might look like for this interesting tech. Perhaps for some of the people in the audience not too familiar with eCash, I'm going to hand it over to one of the technical brains on stage to give us a bit of a laydown on what this entails and some of the different flavors of eCash. Kody?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. So I'm Kody. I work at Fedi, but I'm also a Fedimint open source dev. And I've been working on Fedimint, which is a federated eCash system for almost 3 years now. And so eCash is something that was developed in 1980s as a blinded accounting system, right? So you can think about normal account systems that you have where you give your money to a custodian or just any sort of accounting system where you see everyone that you're custodying for, right? So I deposit at the bank. The bank knows Kody has this much money, and this is Kody's money that I have segregated out. eCash is a mechanism for doing a blinded accounting system. So the bank or the mint or whoever's custodying the money has no idea who its individual users are and what their individual balances are. It only knows what the total amount of money that it holds is and what the total amount of claims that it has issued is, right? So you can think about as a custodian, there's fundamentally two problems. There's the fact that the custodian can see everything, so you lose your privacy, and there's the fact that the custodian is just a single entity holding Bitcoin for many people. eCash is just an attempt to solve the privacy side of it. So we can do a custody system where the users are completely blinded from the mint is completely blinded from the users.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Well, so as I mentioned, I'm glad we have Seth on stage. Me and Seth have had some sparring matches on Twitter about the potential and perhaps the downsides of this technology. So I'd like to hand it over to him and maybe give us perhaps a steelman of the case against eCash and why you have your own concerns over this technology and its potential adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love settings like this because we get into nuance that's just not possible on Twitter. So I hope that we can do a good job diving into the pros and cons and help you make a better decision for yourself what makes sense. So when we're talking eCash, Kody did a great intro there. There's really two main flavors right now. One is Fedimint, where there's a federation of custodians who are working together to custody those funds. They have to collaborate to spend funds. And then there's Cashew, which is an individual person running a mint. They hold all the funds themselves. When it comes to eCash, the biggest concerns that I have are, I guess, threefold. I'll try to kind of summarize even further than I have in the past. One is the incentives are, to me, just truly broken. When you think about Cashew specifically, we'll take that approach first. We're talking about a single person who's going to hold custody of funds, provide privacy for users, and spend however users want to spend from his mint. What that actually means in the real world is that person is, unfortunately, and I think that the regulation should not be this way, that person is acting as a money service business, and they're doing something that is illegal in the U.S. unless they register, they do KYC, AML. I think all of that is bogus. It shouldn't happen, but that seems very clear under the adversarial environment that we're in the U.S. So when we're looking at it, either this person could be anonymous or they could be well-known. If they're anonymous, it's much easier for them to steal funds. Because in eCash, there's no way for users to decide how a custodian handles their funds. They send in their Bitcoin, they get eCash, the custodian can silently inflate the eCash, the custodian can steal the Bitcoin. So if they're anonymous, they're incentivized to rug pull. They could not do that. They could be just a good actor, but they're incentivized to rug pull. If instead the mint operator is well known, if they're a person that everyone in the community knows, they then become a regulatory target. If it's well used and everyone knows who they are, it's going to be a problem. So that's really the first issue that I have. The second one is really that I view eCash as the most bearish of bets on the ability of Bitcoin devs to improve Bitcoin and make self-custody and privacy available to everyone. eCash really, to me, says we can't do it in Bitcoin. So instead, we're going to ask people to give their Bitcoin to custodians, and the custodians will hopefully provide spending tools and privacy for their users. When really, there are tools out there right now, there are proposals for covenants specifically, that allow us to make self-custody and privacy easier and approachable for all. And I think eCash is a very bearish bet on that, and a bearish bet that consumes precious dev resources as well. So that's a very quick synopsis. There's a lot more to get into there, but I don't want to eat up the time for everybody else.
Appreciate it. You made a great case for the sort of perils of custodial services. In reality, obviously, although that's been sort of like historically discouraged in Bitcoin, we've seen that there's been quite a high adoption of eCash, of custodian services, whether it be exchanges, custodial wallets. Notably within the Lightning ecosystem, obviously, there's been quite a lot of progress made into the Lightning infrastructure over the last almost decade now. But it's still the case that some of the UX issues around inbound liquidity, for example, has sort of incentivized users to adopt more custodial solutions. Ben, this is something that I think you've thought about quite a bit. You've sort of like worked on in some respect, and there's I think a lot of people like eCash as perhaps an opportunity, not necessarily to replace users' self-custodial wallet, but at least to promote better custodial services that could at least improve privacy for users. Can you comment and share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a little bit more bearish on the case for eCash on Bitcoin. Not on eCash in general, and the work which is being done on eCash, on Fedi Mint, and on Cashew is great. And it's an incredible permissionless development environment, lots of people contributing amazing code and building great projects. But for me, eCash, so back early on with Lightning, a few of us realized that more and more people were using custodial services like OpenNode, LNpay, because it was just difficult to run a Lightning node, to manage channels and all those things. And developers and users just wanted to engage with the Lightning network. So this is about sort of 5 years ago, 6 years ago or something, I can't remember. So we started the LNbits project, which is specifically, it's designed for you to run yourself as a wallet account system, but it has the function that you can offer a custodial service to your friends, family, the whole world if you want to. And the idea was if you make it easy for people to run custodial services, you end up with more of them and make them run it themselves. So I've had a long time to think about custodial solutions on Bitcoin and on Lightning, and I spend all my time working on a solution which you can use for custodianship. And all custodianship on Bitcoin is a shitcoin, all of it. Anytime someone else owns your Bitcoin and you're using their service and you don't have control over your own keys, you're not running your own node, it's a shitcoin. Thus, eCash by proxy is a shitcoin, and that needs to kind of be acknowledged, that all custodianship is a shitcoin. My concerns over eCash more generally is, like Seth was saying, is the game theory, the incentives. I get the incentive for the user in that they have privacy, but for the mint, there's a huge amount of regulatory burden by running eCash on top of your Lightning node, and also extra complexity, which makes you a target for regulators. And the reality, we don't like regulators and we don't want them, and we want to operate outside of all that and have a dark, murky market of custodians or whatever. But the reality is, like, the custodians I quote unquote trust, like, I don't know, Wallet Satoshi, I use that So far, they haven't stolen my funds, but my funds on Wallet of Satoshi, shitcoin. The other one, Blink by Galloy, one of their more recent offering as a custodian. That's something I trust because I know the people who work on Blink. It's a great platform, and I'm pretty sure that their DevOps is good, and I'm not going to lose my funds, and they're not going to steal my funds. So my funds should be relatively safe on there. So I trust them. By adding eCash on top of their solutions, they're then exposing themselves to lots of more regulation. So I think it's unlikely that they're going to run eCash mints. So the other thing to note as well is that Cashew itself did come out for LNbits in the LNbits community, and a lot of us worked on it early on. And we had the Cashew extension, which was like the world's kind of first functional eCash mint. And we were all very excited about it. And initially, I really liked the idea, but then so we run a demo server for LNbits, and I realized a lot of people were running the eCash mints on our extension on our demo server because maybe they didn't feel comfortable running it themselves. So, and then when it comes to, so the game theory for users I get because of privacy, but the game theory for mints I don't get, because like running a mint entails so much more complexity, and then you're so much more of a target. And then actually the argument that a custodian that gives you privacy is a feature, it could be argued that, you know, having double entry bookkeeping, like if your user is using your custodial service and they need to get in contact about something they're worried about or a bug or something, then it's useful to be able to compare the accounts which they have on their phone, on their wallet, and then also you have in your back end in your database. However, all that being said, I do like eCash a lot, and I think it's going to be a very important technology in the future. But when it comes to running it on Bitcoin, I just can't see the value proposition. But the great thing about Bitcoin is it's permissionless. Anyone can build whatever they want. People can find use case. And if a bunch of people find use cases for eCash mints, fantastic. That's great. And I support that and want that to exist.
Thank you. I think some would say, and certainly I would say, that the perspective with regards to regulation in the context of eCash mints and whatnot is perhaps somewhat tainted by a more Western perspective, right? I think there exists a world where in different parts of or different countries, there are financial systems in a gray area that sort of operate outside the purview of government regulations. If we think of systems like Hawala, who have been thriving for decades and are still moving to this day billions, if not trillions of dollars of money, there seems to exist an opportunity to perhaps scale that in a global manner. And, I think, Eric, I know that you've given a lot of thoughts to the idea that eCash could be used to commoditize perhaps financial service and create somewhat of a new era of free banking innovation where the permissionless and open aspect of the technology allows for many new service providers and entrants to compete with each other, and therefore, reducing the risk of fraud by having so many offerings on the market, where eventually, perhaps, the argument is, well, the markets might sort it out. Do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so to the regulatory points that Seth and Ben have just made, I think, before I get into free banking, imagine it's 2010 and we're looking at the beginning of Bitcoin, and think about similar arguments that were being made against Bitcoin as well. And a lot of this comes from, there's a delineation between looking at something at the micro level and looking at something from the systemic level. Much of Bitcoin's strength and benefit, in fact, all of it exists at a systemic level today, and it took time, energy, and bootstrapping for it to scale to that state over time. From an eCash perspective, that's what kind of led me into this industry. I thought was interesting. I wasn't looking at it technologically. I was reading into free banking theory and, how Fedi always had this vision of Bitcoin scaling economically. I'll use the term scaling economically for the devs up here. But Bitcoin scaling transaction throughput from a free banking system, which is just private notes being issued by banks, by custodians, and allowing the market to sort out what's valuable and what's not. I think when you take that perspective and you look at the system from a systemic level, eCash is a very optimal technology for the emergence of a free banking system. I think if we're arguing that there's going to be scaling mechanisms at a technical level that Bitcoin is going to achieve, and those are going to be competitive against trusted mechanisms, that's a tall order. That's a very tough argument to make. It's not that we're not making progress here, but fundamentally, in markets, people don't care about, what is going on behind all of this. We do because we're major advocates for this industry. But as we think about Bitcoin scaling to the rest of the world, and that's happening very rapidly right now, value is going to flow towards the path of least resistance, and trusted systems are always going to have an economic benefit, barring some 0 to 1 innovation that occurs. There's always going to be an economic benefit of user experience and lower cost in some way, shape, or form with the cost of trust. So it's not that I'm arguing for this is ideal. I'm arguing from the perspective that this is where markets will naturally be guided. They have been guided this direction for centuries. They'll continue to be guided this direction. And unless we can create scaling technologies at a technical level that are at least that competitive, it's the burden of proof is on us to really say what is and isn't going to happen from that angle. So that's what led me into eCash. And I was like, okay, well, it's a really cool idea that we can take the concept of a bank and we can make it incredibly low cost to spin up. We can distribute the trust assumptions of it, and we can make it part of an open protocol network. I think that changes the way banking technology can effectively work in the future. So free banking systems function somewhat reasonably well in history of just private markets sorting out what bank's a good bank based on how solvent they are and what bank's a bad bank based on them issuing more notes and fractionally reserving and eventually going insolvent. With eCash mints, we can use software and we can use cryptography, and we can create novel forms of functionality that have never really existed in banking systems before. But like, even putting all that aside, going back to comparing this to Bitcoin, I think when you view it at a systemic level, like, what made Bitcoin decentralized? A very low marginal cost to participate in the network. And a lot of the block size wars were fought over that idea of trying to keep the marginal cost of participation very low. The higher the cost to participate, the harder it is and the greater degree of centralization that starts to emerge. We're taking that idea of the cost of participating in a financial network with a trusted system, and we can make that materially lower than, while in technical circles there's a lot of, it's not as clear. But if you compare that to the financial system that exists today, we can take that and we can create a banking system that's vastly more efficient. And from that, all these markets of like reputation management and things that create information transparency and all of the variables that increase competition, those can emerge in a way that they haven't in history. Like, that's what I'm really excited about, is that I don't think we always need perfect technological solutions to everything. In the same way that Bitcoin beautifully worked by aligning incentives of the network, I think the exact same thing can happen at a systemic level with eCash, is that we can have incentive alignment. I've been going for a while, so we can get into the detail on a lot of that.
Yeah, I was going to throw it to you, Kody, because I think, Eric mentioned, the path of least resistance, and obviously that comes from the fact that using Bitcoin in a sovereign manner at the end of the day is going to be expensive, especially now, but especially in the future. And I think, Eric spoke about, free banking and whatnot. Community bank is something that you guys at Fedi have been looking at quite a bit. You can share your thoughts on some of that and whatever you wanted to reply to.
Yeah, so if I could take a kind of a moment to sort of summarize where we've gone, right, is that when it comes to custodians, and I think everyone here on the panel, is that as Bitcoin exists today, without like a future soft fork, without some of the covenants proposals and all those kinds of things, which I think everybody here is mostly in favor of, like if it's done in like a judicious manner, Bitcoin as it exists today for many people requires some sort of custodial mechanism for them to get present benefit out of it. So, for example, like some of the points that have been brought up are like not exactly like a Western focus, but like some people have that it's like many of the communities that we work with within Fedi, right? Like they're under places where if they do self-custody, if they do like geographically locate the storage mechanisms that they're using with themselves, they're actually actively being attacked by their governments for that. And so being able to, for example, distribute it, use custodians who are outside of that jurisdiction, that sort of thing, is like something that's a material benefit for them. But when it comes to eCash specifically, like I said, right, there's the custodial problems, which I think many of the game theory aspects, it kind of depends where you are. It goes very in detail on that, but the eCash focus is on that privacy aspect for it. And so the two protocols right now doing eCash of Fedimint and Cashew for it, both of those, I think the case that they're trying to make is that on net, given Bitcoin where it is today, where it requires some level of custodianship for certain people, for those people, it would be a net benefit if the baseline for them was to be able to achieve privacy through using eCash. And then there are ways that you can get around some of the user experience. That's like one of the things Fedi's focused on for, yes, there are problems associated with it. Like we see them all the time with people where they're just getting used to it. And it's like, yeah, it would be nice if I could see all of their information. But, you know, it would be great to see all their information to solve a lot of user experiences. But it was good for them to have the ability to opt into giving you that information as opposed to the default being that as a custodian, you're seeing everything that your user are doing all the time instead of them being able to opt into it, having the baseline be privacy, which is what I think eCash, as it exists today, is something that is an extremely useful tool for.
Yeah, I mean, so with eCash, I live in Wales and in the UK, and we want Wales to be free from the UK. We want to, you know, leave Wales. We want to leave the UK, sorry. And I could imagine, like, one of the tools of liberation for us is creating a Welsh pound, which is pegged to, you know, some currencies or assets or whatever. And for that, Fedimint makes perfect sense. It would be great for us to have that, because it's all about decentralizing blame. So with Bitcoin, the reason it exists and we have this crazy, ugly blockchain thing is you're decentralizing who's responsible for issuing that thing. And with custody, with custodial solutions like an eCash mint, you are more of a target. So you can federate it, but then achieving a good federation, which doesn't get Sybil attacked, that doesn't end up just taking the funds, it's costly and it's hard. And I'm not sure whether some of those communities, I mean, I don't think we could achieve that here, you know, but I think maybe on a nation level, it makes sense. Like the El Salvador, they should have an El Salvador dollar, and they should use eCash. That makes perfect sense to me. So for me, like the work done, the analogy for me on eCash and the work being done is that one of those people who had to cut through the forest to get to the end of this destination. And there's a group of people, and they're very efficiently cutting through this forest, and then they almost get to the destination, and then the guy at the back, he climbs up a tree, he looks around, he says, okay, wrong forest. So the work is great, and it's productive, and great things are being built, but a scaling solution, which depends on custody and custodianship, isn't a scaling solution for me on Bitcoin. We need to move away from that, and it is possible. Yeah.
So I agree. It's not that I don't think it's possible. I think that the question isn't whether or not it's possible. It's whether it's competitive in a market. That's the key thing that I think a lot of technical people need to be posing these questions as, because everything is going to come down to that in terms of what proportion of the market is ultimately adopting these technologies.
Yeah, just kind of harking back to something that both Ben and Kody have been hitting on, this idea of eCash fixes the privacy, and really the implementations of eCash are how to approach the custody angle of making custodians better, which is a common pitch for eCash. I think that also breaks down very quickly, because when you think about what user of a custodian needs privacy, it's not the community custodian user. It's not someone in a village is the one who's custodying funds, or maybe a set of elders are the ones custodying funds. Everyone knows each other. Everyone knows when I'm depositing funds and getting eCash. There's not nearly as much of a need, at least, for strong internal cryptographic privacy within that custodian. It's a nice to have, but it's not nearly as vital. But when we look at what I think is often the way that eCash is pitched, is that it will replace things like Wallet of Satoshi. And no one on stage here has said that, but that it will replace those things, and that's the whole pitch of better custodians, is that, okay, instead of using Wallet of Satoshi, who has complete visibility into everything that every user is doing, people will opt into an eCash mint, or theoretically Wallet of Satoshi will implement eCash. but I've seen no evidence that that's happening. And I'm just like Ben mentioned, I have no idea how the incentives align to make an existing custodian want to use eCash, and existing custodians are even incentivized to try and prevent custodial mints from existing through regulatory moats, which is a common tactic that is used to create monopolies, which a custodial Bitcoin wallet would love a monopoly.
I think one of the points is that we probably won't see that much evidence of it happening. I think that's kind of one of the cool parts, right?
I mean, you would, because, again, it depends on how the wallet handles it. If the wallet doesn't actually ever give the user custody of the eCash, then yeah, you may not even notice that it's happened, and it could just be a back-end change. But you would notice, but it would be an improvement if it happens. But I don't really understand the incentive structure that's going to make a wallet of Satoshi start doing this.
So, because Ben went into a few anecdotal arguments like this. It could make sense here. It could not make sense here. You're thinking like maybe if the wallet of Satoshi solution, it could make sense here. I think like taking it up a level and removing ourselves from like the anecdotal arguments and being like, okay, well, is it something where I don't think that is a way of looking at the incentives of the market. I think that if we want to look at it from the question of like, if regulators step in, and then do you have to be a regulated scaled mint to ultimately function within this economy, which may or may not be like a Western perspective, and the simple fact that anybody could spin up an eCash mint wherever they are is one of the things that I think is going to, I heard somebody say it's going to basically like make it impossible to implement like the bank cert.
I was the one who said that. I said DDoS the financial system, right? I think the argument there is basically that, like, is there a world where the rapid adoption of eCash services makes it impossible almost for regulators to catch up? Like, I mean, there's many precedent of that from technological perspective. Whether you look at something like torrents, where seeders were originally kind of like prosecuted for uploading files and whatnot, and over the last couple of years or over the last decades, governments all around the world have practically given up on the idea of trying to prosecute for those things because it's kind of like a bit of a cat and mouse game where it becomes impossible. Even my question personally has been around, well, there's been a lot of risk aversion for a very important reason. Obviously, we see cases like Samurai Wallet, very unfortunate cases of people being prosecuted for offering, services, technology-based services, really. But you look at what's happening in the crypto industry in general and the proliferation of altcoins, you have websites like Palm.fund where people are literally spinning up new coins every other day. And is there a case to be made that they've literally made it impossible for regulators to catch up? And is this something that, like, I'm not trying to suggest that people put themselves in regulators' crosshair, but is there something to be said about the case that maybe like the way that Uber went about sort of scaling up in such a quick and large manner that regulators were sort of like forced to maybe adapt to the new reality and the new technology paradigm that something like eCash might offer?
Exactly. Yeah, because I think that's the most important point. If we have a low marginal cost to participate in the network and people can do that permissionlessly, then that changes the incentives of who and who can't be regulated. I also think that you could have eCash mints totally function as regulated institutions. I could see it being used as a fundamental banking technology. I just think that there's not this non and regulated class. It's a technology that's going to have a variety of different applications, and I think it's optimizing across a lot of those different functions we're using for basic financial tech.
Yeah, if I could pull it back to some of the community things, because that's some of the arguments that people have been making for where these initial ones would be set, and the importance of privacy within those communities. And so it's something on the order, HRF is one of the sponsors for this stage, right? Is that something on the order of 80% of the world lives under an authoritarian regime today. And when it comes to achieving privacy within your local community, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually even more important in those ones because you have people who are your neighbors who might not be amenable to you not being on board with whatever the local government is, or you might have like the government being actively involved with like trying to find people and involve themselves in their financial affairs and those kinds of things. So having the possibility of being able to have a baseline of privacy that you can opt into revealing more information about yourself becomes very, very important. And then again, like for Fedi specifically, the implementation detail of this is being able to take those guardians and resiliently back them up across many different places. Like Seth, I know you're like very deeply involved in like the self-custody and for foundation devices and those kinds of things. Like a point I always like to bring up about self-custody is that any self-custody solution resilient to you being in an accident individually as the custodian for that implies some sort of custodial or recovery mechanism that can be met outside of yourself. And one of the cool possibilities with things like Fedi is that you can, out of the box, give a threshold backup mechanism through the guardians or through other people within the local community, so that in the event that something does happen to you, or you break your device, or you lose something, or anything like that, then you can opt into having one of those threshold backup mechanisms for it, like by, for example, sharding the seed across the guardians, or only sharding a part of the threshold for the seeds across them, so that your wife, for example, could go back to those guardians and be able to do that. So there's some possibilities for this within local communities for it. And the point that Eric's making, right, is that it is an open market for these things. And so it's important to allow the market to kind of decide for these. And so the communities that want to do this stuff and find value in it, that they have the possibility of being able to engage in it instead of just not having it as a possibility at all for them to choose.
In soft currency,
let's just throw it over to Ben, and we can have you guys respond to some of that. Yeah.
There's nothing more than soft currency producing countries hate than when somebody else starts to produce currency. And this is my other concern with eCash. So on Bitcoin. So if you give someone your Bitcoin and then they give you something which they claim is pegged to Bitcoin or is Bitcoin, it's not. It's you're printing something new, and it could be argued that just like the Liberty Dollar with Knothall, countries go after you if you start printing currency. So going back to my original point, the reason we have these ridiculous blockchain things is to distribute who's to blame for that. Whereas if you have eCash mints, they become a target. And it's not something it's not something you can do. We exist in regulated markets. If we exist in like a cypherpunk utopia, and hopefully one day we will, then absolutely it makes sense. And it'd be nice to see some private banking experimentation. But the private banking analogy is very good, because all those private banks were producing their own currency, and that's why they were stopped by government, because the government wants the monopoly over soft currency production. Bitcoin gets a pass, because who do you blame? Who do you go after? It's unstoppable technology. But I'm not sure the whack-a-mole censorship resistance and resilience via whack-a-mole in this case makes sense.
Is a federation, let's call it a 70 of 100 federation distributed globally, is that better than having your money at Coinbase or Wallet of Satoshi?
So the argument of whether it's better to have your money in Coinbase or Wallet of Satoshi, so I would prefer to know the one service I'm using, who I have a relationship with, who I trust. This is the point of federations and having civil attacks, that you can have a lot of honest parties who you see in that federation and you think, okay, this is a trustful federation, but then the overwhelming majority of that federation, you might not know who they are, and then they might be the civil attack, which then steals your funds. So I mean, the idea of like hoster channels and being able to federate your own custodian ownership over, Lightning on your wallet, so you have a Lightning wallet, and then using hosted channels from different service providers, that makes sense. Like, you federate your own risk, and then if one of them rips you off, it's not all your money. But I'm disinclined to trust one big federation unless I know they're putting in the legwork to keep that federation honest. And then that's a big public entity, like something like Liquid, and if you join Liquid as a functionary, like a guy flies on a plane, brings a box, plugs it in. You can't be geographically too close to other functionaries. They spend millions keeping that federation honest, and I'm not sure that work will be done on the federations. This concept of having loads of federations.
Yeah, I want to harp on that concept a little bit and clarify one thing. I love the idea of community custody. Like, I want to make that really clear, and that's the one thing that I've tried to be really clear about when I talk about it on Twitter and here as well, because I think the idea of Bitcoin banking by a community and enabling that is fascinating and powerful and absolutely worth pursuing. I think the problem is when we expand past that at all, we quickly have to remind ourselves that we are not in an environment where governments are friendly towards building things that replace them. We have to build tools understanding that governments are going to try and shut down any tool that attempts to replace them. And I love the theory of free banking. I really did thoroughly enjoy reading your ebook. I went through it in detail last night. I love the theory, but the theory that a government would allow centralized custodial services that print their own money, as Ben was mentioning, as that's essentially what eCash is. And you even argued in a lot of ways that they could use eCash in similar ways, even intentional debasement, a lot of things that people aren't comfortable with in the current regime. The idea that that will just be allowed to happen when each of those individual custodians have incentives that make it very hard for them to be a known entity or to be anonymous, it worries me that none of this can actually exist in reality, and that the dev time and the resources that we pour into creating better eCash solutions will be built thinking that we'll be able to deploy these and do these great theoretical ideas when governments are not going to allow that, and these things are very, very vulnerable to adversarial environments. And that's a lot of the crux of my issue with eCash is in a cypherpunk utopia, as Ben mentioned, it, I think, would be a fantastic tool, and I think even the need for self-custody would be greatly reduced, but we're not in that utopia. We are in quite the opposite of that utopia, and that's where a lot of the problems lie.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Many of these things require, like, getting the system to scale, being utopia and all of that. Use trustless systems, learn how to do all their own Bitcoin. That's the ideal. My long-term view is that Bitcoin is a form of money in the same way the dollar has different means of exchange associated with it. You have deposits, you have checks, you have credit card transfers, all these other things. That's all being built around Bitcoin. eCash is potentially one of those that's really interesting.
Unfortunately, this is the only time that we had, thanks to the Orange Men. Obviously, as always, do your own research and trust, but verify, maybe. Appreciate you guys being on the panel. I mean, this could have been like a fantastic hour-plus conversation, obviously. So I encourage everyone to do their own research. Thanks for joining me on the stage. Thanks for showing up, guys, today. And I hope you enjoyed the conference. Cheers.